Alright, I'm gonna flip it sideways here, because that's what the people want. Give them what they want. Let it snow. Yeah. Pay no attention to the sign behind the man. The best way to turn your podcast into a book is don't turn your podcast into a book. Before you click away and say, man, you trolled me, you sucker. That's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. The best way to turn your podcast into a book is to not intend to do that. Tools for Titans is old news. Okay, you know what Tools for Titans is. It's Tim Ferriss's book where he turns podcast interviews, massive collection, into a book that he sold as a massive hardcover, like 600 pages. Okay, that's an old tool. And by saying tool, I'm referring to jobs to be done theory, where customers buy tools to get jobs done, and and the tool that they perceive is going to do the best job for them is what they buy. Well, guess what? We have podcastnotes.org now. Most podcasters, you included, create notes of your podcast. Okay? And what do? You give them away for free. At least the transcript, or maybe the summarized version of the transcript. Some people have some sort of a subscription service where they make it available for $4.99 a month or whatever. I actually ran the numbers on this. I have converted no fewer than 8 different authors' podcasts into books. Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right. Didn't I just say that I could teach you how to turn your podcast into a book? But then don't do that? But then you say you've done it before? Something ain't right. Here's what it is. I recommend that you author a book independent of your podcast. By that I mean, yes, use your podcast transcripts as reference material, but not as the main event. Not as the main event. On all of the books that I've ghostwritten, including the ones that have been international bestsellers, what we did is we wrote the book and then said, you know what this needs? It needs additional authority, credibility, and expertise. Where's the right place to do that? Number one, when you need to give examples inside of your book, what do? You reference such and such podcast guest and the story they told you on your podcast, which you already have the transcript for. When you're talking about something like, I'll give the example of fitness. Maybe you're the fitness trainer, but you're not necessarily a board-certified nutritionist, or maybe you start talking about cancer-causing issues, but you're not an expert on cancer. You're not an oncologist. Guess what you do? You then whip out your podcast, the interview transcript, where you interviewed the board-certified nutritionist and the oncologist. Because guess what you get to do now? You get to, as the author, coast on their expertise. Their expertise that they have as an oncologist, as a board-certified nutritionist. Because the conversation they had with you was on your podcast, you own it. You basically co-own that expertise. And then when you put it in your book, and then when you say, this person said this famous expert said this on my podcast to me in conversation with me, that is as close to you saying it as possible. So the right way, the best way to repurpose your podcast interviews is to only repurpose that which you need. At Andrew Strom says borrowed expertise is a great lever. Yes, you pull that lever as often as you can when you have a podcast. So that's my recommendation, is when you write your book, when you author your book, don't think, how do I turn my podcast into a book? Say, how do I write the best, most persuasive book I possibly can for my audience? Assuming a lot of them have probably already heard a lot of these interviews, right? Assume they've already heard a lot of these interviews. Don't try to write Tools for Titans 2.0. That's old news, okay? That's old news. Anytime you try to emulate what the first greatest person did, you look like a cheap replica of that. 99% of personal development books, especially the self-published ones, are repackaged versions of Brian Tracy, Louise Hay, Tony Robbins, and they're 10 times worse. 10 times worse. With cheesier stories and bad titles. So don't be that guy. Don't be that gal. Don't be that, whatever the gender-neutral version of that is. Yes, I can be a little woke. It's only 10:32 p.m. Eastern Time. So the wokest of the woke is yet to come. So I'm going to advise you, as you're thinking about your podcast, you've got all this content. Maybe you've got a few dozen shows. Maybe you've got hundreds of episodes done. What do you do with all that content? Well, you think, what book can you write for your audience, your listeners, that would say, wow, they haven't seen this before. They haven't seen this before. I have not put all of my expertise in one place. So the podcast the book must be your expertise. But when you need to have an exciting example, an illustrative one, or when you need to talk about something that you're out over your skis on, so to speak, by that I mean you're not really a credentialed expert or even have personal experience with it directly, what you do is you then cite the expert that you've interviewed on that subject matter. And then it's like that person is almost a co-author with you of your own book. I see David Headmaster, the founder of the Arsenal podcast. He has interviewed some big names. So if he was going to write a book, he's going to author a book, and he needed an example or he needed to speak on a topic where he wasn't necessarily thought of himself as the biggest expert, but I know he's had Ed Lattimore on his podcast, he's had me on his podcast, so what would he do? He would quote us on the subject matter. Maybe he has a chapter on writing, for example. Okay, who is he going to quote? Me. He has something about hard work, discipline, being smart in the streets. Who's going to quote? Ed. It's true. All of it. Smiley face. I think Julia, I just saw the name flash by, asked about podcast guests. Typically, you don't pay podcast individuals, like podcast guests, to show up. I know there are some out there. There are even a few podcasts nowadays where you have to pay to be on the podcast. But I could go on. But I want to keep this short, just to keep it tight, keep it good, keep it cool, keep it chill. And that's my advice. The best way to turn your podcast into a book is to don't turn your podcast into a book. Write the amazing book, author the amazing book, and then when you need stories that you don't really have one that comes to mind immediately, you say, well, what's that story about? What kind of story do I need here? What kind of an example do I need here? Oh, I can pull that one interview from that one famous person. So you're using your podcast transcripts as like a library of materials to pull from. So that's that. And then the other way is where you need to have an expert. You need to actually cite someone that you can trust, that rather the public can trust, and say, oh yeah, that person's totally an expert. You put what the segment of the interview was, or from the interview, and then you put it in the section where you need to sound qualified, credentialed, maybe even have footnotes. Instead of putting a footnote for a study, you put the person you talked to there. So that's that. Take care.